The air was quiet in Bay Village, Ohio, a lakeside suburb that rarely made the headlines, where neighbors still left their doors unlocked, and where violent crime was more a television concept than a lived reality. But that illusion shattered on a summer morning when the body of Marilyn Shepard was found brutally slain in her own home. It was the kind of crime that didn't belong to this neighborhood, or so everyone thought. She was discovered lying on her bed, her head nearly unrecognizable from the number of blows it had sustained. Blood had soaked the linens, splattered the walls, and settled into the crevices of the hardwood floor. The room bore the chaotic signs of a violent confrontation, but something about it felt off. Drawers were opened, but not emptied. Items were disturbed, but not stolen. No valuables were missing. There was no broken window, no forced entry. And her husband, Dr. Sam Shepard, was the one who had called for help. Sam claimed to have been asleep downstairs on the daybed in the living room. He said he was awakened by the sound of his wife screaming his name. When he ran upstairs, he said he saw a bushy-haired man attacking Marilyn in the bedroom. A struggle ensued, and Sam said he was struck from behind and knocked unconscious. By the time he came to, the man was gone, and Marilyn was already dead. It was a story that, from the beginning, left investigators skeptical. The crime scene was examined by local police, but the initial response was anything but methodical. Officers and neighbors trampled through the house before any evidence could be secured. The body was not immediately moved, but the integrity of the scene was already compromised. Photographs taken at the time showed a disordered bedroom, a blood-soaked pillow, and bloodstains reaching far up the walls. Evidence of an attack both frenzied and prolonged. No murder weapon was recovered. What raised immediate suspicion was the physical state of Dr. Shepard. He bore only minor injuries, a swollen face, a few bruises, some scratches, but nothing consistent with a life-threatening struggle against a man he described as powerful and violent. There were no defensive wounds on his hands, no fractured bones, no head trauma that would explain being rendered unconscious. Investigators began asking questions. Marilyn Shepard was 31 years old, 4 months pregnant, and by all appearances the embodiment of domestic stability. She was well-liked in the community, active in charity work, and a devoted mother to their young son. There were no reports of erratic behavior, no known enemies, and no record of domestic violence in the household. But the deeper the authorities dug, the more cracks appeared in the image of the Shepards as the idyllic American family. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of an affair, marital tension, emotional distance. Some family friends admitted that Sam and Marilyn had not been the same in recent months. Sam was often away, immersed in his duties at Bayview Hospital where he served as chief of neurosurgery. Marilyn, by contrast, was at home, isolated and stressed, particularly in the early months of her second pregnancy. It was emotional, and so, Sam Shepard was no longer just a grieving husband. He was a prime suspect. But this was just the beginning. What would follow over the next decade would be one of the most controversial and consequential murder cases in American legal history. A story of obsession, manipulation, flawed justice, and the fine line between guilt and reasonable doubt. And at the center of it all, a woman whose voice had been silenced, and a man who claimed he never heard her scream. In the days following Marilyn Shepard's murder, the facade of an ideal life began to collapse. To those who only knew the Shepards through neighborhood greetings and occasional social gatherings, they appeared to be the portrait of suburban success. A well-known doctor, a devoted mother, a handsome lakefront home. But what lay beneath was more complicated, fragile, and in hindsight, deeply fractured. Investigators quickly expanded their scope beyond the bloodstains and broken timelines. They began asking a more uncomfortable question. Not who could have broken into the Shepard home, but who inside had motive. The focus shifted to understanding the dynamics of the couple's relationship. Marilyn's life, once viewed through the lens of tragedy, was now being dissected for signs of forewarning. Family members and close friends were brought in for questioning. A different image of the Shepard household emerged, one marked not by violence, but by emotional distance, stress, and the pressures of a strained marriage. Colleagues of Dr. Shepard described him as ambitious, often preoccupied, and increasingly unavailable at home. He spent long hours at the hospital, sometimes staying overnight. Marilyn, meanwhile, had reportedly expressed concerns to friends about his absence and their growing disconnect. She had recently begun asking him to be more present with their young son, more engaged in family life. But the conversations were always brief, always unresolved. Then came the revelation that would reshape the case: the existence of another woman. Her name was Susan Hayes, a former lab technician, young, intelligent, and connected to Sam through his work. When questioned, she admitted to having a romantic relationship with him, while she initially tried to downplay its significance. The admission alone was enough to shift the investigation's tone. It was no longer a question of whether Sam had something to hide. It was now a matter of how much. To the public, the affair became a symbol, proof that the polished life of the Shepherds wasn't so polished after all. To investigators, it represented a motive: a man conflicted between two worlds, a wife expecting a second child, a relationship facing internal collapse, and then a murder, brutal, personal, and without clear explanation. The question investigators had to answer was not only who had the capacity to commit such a crime, but who stood to benefit from it, if not materially, then emotionally or psychologically. The crime scene did not support a typical burglary. There were no valuables missing, no forced entry. The family dog, known to bark at strangers, had remained quiet through the night. Sam claimed to have pursued a mysterious man to the lakefront and lost consciousness, but no physical trace of that man was ever found. No foreign footprints, no blood trail beyond the home, no eyewitness reports of anyone fleeing the area. Instead, the pieces that remained all pointed inward. The wristwatch and ring belonging to Sam had been found later, hidden in odd places on the property. His shirt from the night before had vanished. The timeline he provided became increasingly difficult to verify. And while minor injuries were visible on his body, none seemed consistent with a life-and-death struggle. Still, this was not a case to be solved in days, not with limited forensic science, not with a contaminated crime scene, and not with a high-profile suspect who, until then, had no criminal record, no history of aggression, and a well-respected career. The Shepherd home was no longer just a private residence. It became a stage, visited by law enforcement, attorneys, journalists, and photographers. Every inch of it was scrutinized. Every object, movement, and a minute leading up to Marilyn's death was analyzed. And yet the answer remained elusive. What kept the case alive in the public consciousness was not only the brutality of the crime, but the enigma of Sam Shepherd himself. To some, he was a grieving husband under siege. To others, he was a man hiding behind the calm exterior of a trained surgeon. But in the absence of physical evidence or a clear eyewitness, opinion filled the void. And that opinion was being shaped not in courtrooms, but on the front pages of Cleveland newspapers. Articles speculated wildly. One piece questioned whether Sam had been a willing participant in a murder-for-love scenario. Another suggested he may have flown into a fit of rage after a marital dispute. None of these theories were backed by hard evidence, but the headlines were loud and the facts were quiet. Public perception began to harden against him. Sam's refusal to speak further with the police, on the advice of his attorney, was interpreted not as caution, but as guilt. When he remained at home instead of attending his wife's funeral, citing medical and emotional distress, the community turned colder. He was becoming isolated. Even his family, who initially rallied around him, began to fracture under the weight of attention and doubt. Yet in the chaos of suspicion and speculation, one voice was missing: Marilyn's. As investigators worked through statements and reconstructed timelines, they also turned to Marilyn's final weeks. Letters, personal notes, and conversations with friends painted a subtle but painful picture. She was overwhelmed, quietly frustrated. In one note to a close friend, she mentioned feeling like something was off, but didn't elaborate. She had not confided in many. Whatever tension she lived through, she endured it quietly, until the night she was silenced for good. The emotional weight of her absence lingered in every photograph of the crime scene. The nursery half prepared for a new baby, her son's toys stacked neatly beside the fireplace, a family table that would never again seat four. These weren't just details, they were consequences. As week 2 of the investigation unfolded, The community grew more restless. Pressure mounted on law enforcement to act. The media was relentless. The mayor and police officials were publicly criticized for not making an arrest. Accusations of incompetence began surfacing in editorials and broadcast interviews. Inside the station, the case files were thick with inconsistencies. Sam's story was difficult to verify, but still not definitively disproven. The scene suggested an emotional killing, but lacked definitive links. The presence of the affair suggested motive, but not necessarily guilt. Despite it all, a decision was made. The evidence was circumstantial, but the pressure was not. The balance tipped, and Sam Shepard was arrested for the murder of his wife. At that moment, the story moved from tragedy to spectacle. The public didn't just want answers, they wanted a resolution. They wanted to believe in a system that could explain the horror of that morning. And if Sam Shepard was guilty, they wanted to see justice done. But if he wasn't, then the real killer was still out there. And that was a far more terrifying possibility. By the time Sam Shepard stood before a judge and jury, he was no longer just a husband under suspicion. He was a man already condemned in the minds of the public. What had begun as a brutal, unsolved homicide quickly evolved into one of the most sensationalized trials in American history. And much of that transformation happened not in courtrooms, but in headlines. In the weeks following Marilyn Shepard's murder, media outlets, especially the Cleveland Press, began crafting a narrative more compelling than any police report. They leaned heavily into the details of Sam's personal life, turning marital distance and infidelity into signs of motive, tempering every article with suggestion, not fact. "Why isn't Sam Shepard in jail?" read one headline, followed by editorials demanding his arrest, criticizing law enforcement, and all but declaring him guilty. That narrative, fed daily to the public, made objectivity nearly impossible. Neighbors who once offered sympathy now offered suspicion. The public stopped asking who killed Marilyn. They began asking when Sam would pay for it. The prosecution capitalized on this momentum. In court, they acknowledged the absence of key forensic evidence. No murder weapon had ever been found. No clear witness had seen an intruder. No blood-stained clothes belonging to Sam had been recovered. But what they lacked in physical evidence, they made up for in psychology. They painted Sam as a man with a double life, a respected doctor in public, a cheating, disinterested husband in private. They leaned hard on his affair with Susan Hayes. Susan testified truthfully that she and Sam had a romantic relationship, and although she denied it had anything to do with Marilyn's death, the damage was done. Her words weren't just heard, they were amplified. Her presence was not simply a revelation, it was fuel for the narrative that Sam had a reason to rid himself of a pregnant wife. Prosecutors pointed to inconsistencies in Sam's own account. He claimed he had been knocked unconscious by an intruder, chased the man to the beach, and blacked out. But the nature of his injuries didn't seem to match such a violent encounter. His wounds were relatively minor. No other man was ever found. And crucially, no evidence of a break-in was ever confirmed. Still, none of this amounted to proof. The case, at its core, was circumstantial. There were no fingerprints that didn't belong in the house. No signs that Sam had struck his wife. No confession. But to a jury exposed to months of accusatory press coverage, Sam's silence and composure read his guilt. His courtroom demeanor was professional, some said cold, and that perception, rather than any concrete detail, seemed to drive the deliberation. Defense attorney William Corrigan argued fiercely. He highlighted the contamination of the crime scene, the police's early fixation on Sam, and the public pressure that had shaped the entire investigation. He reminded the jury that suspicion was not proof, that motive was not murder, and that reasonable doubt must be respected. But his voice, like the facts of the case, was largely drowned out by a tide of presumption. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On December 21, 1954, Sam Shepard was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. In that moment, the court declared justice had been served, but for many watching closely, the verdict did not feel like justice. It felt like surrender. The trial had never truly been about what could be proven. It had been about what the public had been primed to believe. The evidence hadn't changed, only the lens through which it was viewed. Sam Shepard left the courtroom in handcuffs, his life shattered. His mother died by suicide shortly after the conviction. His father passed away within a year. His medical license was stripped. His home was lost. His son Chip would be raised by relatives. Sam, once a prominent doctor, was now inmate number A23709. And yet, even in those darkest days, a few legal observers, journalists, and civil rights advocates saw in his case something deeply troubling. It wasn't just about one man. It was about the justice system itself, how quickly it could bend under public pressure, how easily it could be steered by the media, and how fragile due process became when spectacle replaced scrutiny. This wasn't simply a conviction, it was a warning. Sam Shepard entered prison not as a man convicted by conclusive evidence, but as one condemned by momentum. The trial, overwhelmed by speculation and shaped by public opinion, had ended with a life sentence. What followed was not just incarceration, it was exile from everything he had once been: husband, father, surgeon, citizen. Inside Ohio Penitentiary, Shepard's existence was stripped to routine. He worked in the prison hospital, treating inmates as best he could with limited resources. Despite the hostile surroundings, he maintained a quiet discipline, avoiding conflict. He never confessed. He never changed his story. He insisted from his cell and in every appeal that he had been wrongly accused and convicted without proof. But the outside world had little interest in his claims. Public perception had solidified. To many, the trial was a closed book. The murder of Marilyn Shepard had shocked the nation, and Sam's conviction had offered resolution. Few wanted to reopen the wound. What continued to disturb legal observers, however, was how that resolution had been reached. Transcripts of the original trial revealed glaring irregularities. The media had permeated the courtroom. Jurors had not been sequestered, despite the overwhelming press coverage. Headlines had run almost daily, including during deliberation. Witness testimony was shaped by suggestion rather than science. The physical evidence had never been fully tested, let alone understood. No fingerprints, no murder weapon, no concrete timeline, and yet a guilty verdict. These inconsistencies didn't go unnoticed forever. In the early 1960s, Shepard's case drew the attention of a young defense attorney named F. Lee Bailey. Sharp, methodical, and tireless, Bailey saw in the Shepard conviction not just a legal failure, but a constitutional one. His approach was not based on sentiment, but on fact. An audit of the entire investigation and trial, he unearthed critical failures. The original crime scene had been mishandled, with dozens of people walking through it before evidence could be preserved. Key items had gone missing. The timeline presented at trial was inconsistent with forensic logic. Perhaps most damning, the press had published interviews with witnesses and law enforcement before they even testified, tainting the process further. Bailey also questioned why the investigation had fixated solely on Sam. While the theory of an unknown intruder was weakly supported, it had not been seriously explored. Other potential suspects were either dismissed or never investigated. The tunnel vision was clear. Once Sam was identified as the suspect, all evidence was filtered through that lens. Bailey's appeal made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The core argument was simple. Sam Shepard had not received a fair trial. The justices agreed. In 1966, the court ruled that the original proceedings had been so compromised by media interference and judicial failure that the verdict could not stand. The ruling was historic. It redefined the standards for a fair trial in high-profile cases, reinforcing the balance between a free press and due process. For Shepard, it meant one thing: he would stand trial again. After nearly a decade in prison, Sam Shepard was released on bond pending retrial. But the man who walked out was no longer the surgeon who had once commanded respect in operating rooms and social circles. He had aged quickly. His face was worn. His posture, once confident, now cautious. He had missed his son's childhood, lost his wife in the most violent way imaginable, and spent 10 years viewed by the public as a killer. Freedom in this case came with nothing resembling vindication. He returned to a world that remembered the crime, but not the details. The name Sam Shepard had become cultural shorthand for scandal. He couldn't resume his medical career. His license had been suspended, and his reputation irreparably damaged. Every attempt to reestablish a normal life was met with suspicion. To the public, he had been released. But for many, he had not been proven innocent. In interviews after his release, Sam remained restrained. He rarely expressed anger. His voice was measured. Yet the toll was visible. He had lost more than his freedom. He had lost his place in the world. The state had taken 10 years from him, but it had also taken his identity. The retrial would offer a chance to correct the legal record, but it would not restore the life he once had. Sam Shepard walked out of prison in 1964 a free man, but not an exonerated one. The Supreme Court had ruled that his trial had been a miscarriage of justice, tainted by media bias and a failure to ensure due process. Still, in the eyes of many, especially those who remembered the headlines more than the facts, the name Sam Shepard remained stained. Freedom did not bring restoration. The medical community refused to reinstate his license. Hospitals wouldn't hire him. He was no longer Dr. Shepard. He was a controversial figure, a man the system had punished and then released, but never cleared. The trial may have been flawed, but the murder still happened. Marilyn was still dead. And for many, Sam's connection to that night had never been fully broken. He attempted to rebuild. He remarried, sought out new opportunities, and even entered the world of professional wrestling. A far cry from the operating room, but perhaps the only space where his notoriety could be turned into something tangible. It was spectacle, not redemption. His physical strength remained, but emotionally he was adrift. His second marriage collapsed. His public appearances were awkward reminders of a man who once held lives in his hands, now struggling to hold his own together. Substance abuse became part of his decline. He drank heavily, battled depression, and spoke rarely about the years he lost. His death in 1970, at just 46, came quietly. Officially, liver failure. Unofficially, a slow collapse of a man whose identity had been dismantled one piece at a time. But the story didn't end with his death. Richard "Chip" Shepard was only 7 when his mother was killed. He grew up in the long shadow of 2 parents, one buried too soon, the other imprisoned, released, then destroyed by stigma. As a young man, Chip watched his father attempt to reclaim a life he no longer fit into. He saw the world move on, content with half-truths and unresolved questions. By adulthood, Chip had one objective: to find out what really happened. He launched a private investigation in the 1990s, determined not just to clear his father's name, but to uncover the truth that had evaded 2 trials and decades of speculation. He hired legal teams, forensic experts, and crime scene analysts. The work was methodical, drawing on advancements in DNA testing and crime scene reconstruction that hadn't been available during the original investigation or retrial. Among the names that surfaced in old files and quiet whispers, one stood out: Richard Eberling. Eberling had worked as a window washer in the Shepard home around the time of Marilyn's murder. He had been questioned early in the investigation, but was never seriously pursued. He claimed to have cut himself while working there, a detail that placed his blood in the house, but which was never properly documented or tested. Years later, Eberling was convicted of another violent crime. He remained a suspicious figure, but by the time Chip's team re-examined the case, Eberling was already in prison and nearing death. Still, the investigation Chip funded was able to retrieve DNA samples from items connected to the murder scene. Modern testing revealed a key result. Blood evidence found in the Shepard bedroom did not match Sam Shepard. It belonged to someone else, someone who had never been fully identified. That unknown sample, combined with Eberling's criminal history, turned the focus sharply toward a suspect who, for decades, had been just beyond reach. The deeper Chip and his team dug, the more the story unraveled. Testimony from former associates of Eberling revealed disturbing behavior patterns. He had made comments about Marilyn Shepard years after the murder, hinting at knowledge he shouldn't have had. While never a confession, the statements raised critical questions about what investigators missed or ignored during the original inquiry. For Chip, the search was more than personal. It was existential. He had grown up between narratives, neither fully orphaned nor fully free from the weight of a public tragedy. His pursuit of truth was not just about his father's name, but about his own identity, his mother's memory, and a justice system that had, at every stage, failed to deliver clarity. By the early 2000s, nearly half a century had passed since Marilyn Shepard's life ended inside that quiet home in Bay Village. Yet the case remained unsettled, not in the courts, but in public memory, in the shadows of a damaged family, and in the unrelenting pursuit of one son determined to uncover a truth long buried under error, assumption, and doubt. Richard "Chip" Shepard had already spent years digging through the fragmented remains of a broken investigation. What he and his legal team uncovered led them straight to the name Richard Eberling, a man once considered peripheral, now impossible to ignore. Decades earlier, Eberling had been questioned briefly and dismissed, but that oversight would grow into one of the most troubling aspects of the Shepard case. In the years following the original trial, Eberling's history had grown darker. He had been convicted of multiple crimes, including theft and fraud, and was eventually imprisoned for the murder of an elderly woman. His patterns, his access to private homes, his manipulation of trust, and his apparent fascination with control began to fit a disturbing profile. Chip's team revisited the forensic evidence, this time with tools unavailable in the 1950s or 60s. Blood samples preserved from the crime scene were subjected to modern DNA testing. The results were striking. Blood in the bedroom where Marilyn was murdered did not belong to Sam Shepard. One partial profile was male and unknown. Combined with testimony that Eberling had once bled inside the Shepard home and his later criminal convictions, the trail of suspicion narrowed with disturbing clarity. Further testimony emerged. A former associate of Eberling stated that he had made dark references to the Shepard case over the years. These weren't confessions in the legal sense, but they were enough to suggest that Eberling knew details that had never been made public. Some of these statements matched aspects of the crime scene previously withheld from the press. It appeared increasingly likely that Sam Shepard had served a sentence for a crime he didn't commit, while the real perpetrator walked free for decades. But just as momentum built, the trail went cold. In 1998, Richard Eberling died in prison, taking with him any possibility of formal interrogation or trial. No confession, no cross-examination, no closure. His death denied the Shepard family and the justice system itself the chance to directly confront the man who may have committed the crime. The weight of that absence, of a truth that slipped beyond reach, cast a long shadow. It was the ultimate frustration of justice, evidence that couldn't be acted upon, a suspect who couldn't be prosecuted, a verdict that could no longer be reversed in full. Legally, the case was closed, but morally, it remained wide open. In 2000, Richard Shepard filed a wrongful imprisonment lawsuit against the state of Ohio on behalf of his father. He argued not only that Sam had been wrongly convicted, but that the state had failed to properly investigate alternative suspects, including Eberling. The case reached court, but the burden of proof for a posthumous exoneration was immense. Despite the inconsistencies in the original trial and the mounting evidence pointing elsewhere, the court ultimately ruled against the Shepard estate. Sam Shepard's name was never officially cleared. Marilyn's murder remains, to this day, officially unsolved. The case of the state versus Sam Shepard left behind more than a broken family. It left behind a legal precedent. The 1966 Supreme Court decision became a cornerstone ruling on the limits of media interference in trials. The case is still taught in law schools, used as an example of how due process can be compromised and how the presumption of innocence must be protected, even in the face of public outrage. But legal legacy is not the same as justice. For Marilyn, there was no second chance. Her life was reduced to a case file, her story overshadowed by the man accused of ending it. For Sam, freedom came too late. His career, reputation, and dignity were lost, and he died without the full acknowledgement of his innocence. For Chip, the pursuit of truth consumed years of his life. He came closer than anyone to uncovering what really happened. But even the truth, when found, had limits. In the end, the Shepard case stands not just as a singular tragedy, but as a cautionary tale. It is a story of how justice can be distorted when pressure replaces patience, when storytelling replaces fact, and when process is sacrificed for immediacy. It asks the uncomfortable question: how many more cases like this remain buried beneath the surface, unseen, unresolved, and ultimately unfinished? Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.